those written reports back from the school psych or the external evaluator. And part of that includes that report with those areas of need, and we identify maybe what grade level they're functioning on in terms of written expression, because we know there's a 2 standard deviation between what their grade level is and what they score. You know, there's at least 2 standard deviations. So that's about what information that we get. Once we have those pieces of information, we still have to think about how then do we drill down and really figure out if it's what kind of skill deficit a student might have in the area of writing. How do we drill down to that skill, and then how do we measure that? How do we know what it is that that kid needs? How do we teach that? And then how do we progress monitor? So, you know, we have lots of times you'll see IEP goals written around a fluency goal. Now, so I've seen this mistake in the past that we might have multiple students who have a very similar fluency goal, when really fluency may not be the skill that they really is the priority skill that they need to be working on. And so we have to have some tools and some tricks kind of that we can use to figure out what it is they need. So we're going to look at fluency, syntactic maturity, and semantic. We're going to look at, do they have issues with content? Do they have issues with conventions? Do they have issues with legibility? Or is it the actual writing process that they have trouble with? Reading it, revisiting, reviewing, editing, those kinds of skills. That's a lot of times our students with disabilities really have a deficit there because they lack that ability, you know. And I bet you have this, and you think about this. You give them something to do, a prompt, or you give them something, and they're working on a piece of writing, and they write it one time, and they're done. You know, they're ready to push that away from them, and you say, okay, let's revise it and edit it, and they give you back the exact same thing they gave you to start with. So that's a skill that they don't have, is being able to look at that critically and think through that metacognitive processes. So that takes us to this next slide, and this is what we're going to talk about. So how do we know then? Here's a tool. This is based on the work of Ken Howell and Leanne Robinson. And so this tool has evolved to include more than just that error analysis, but this tool gives us an idea about, we look at what the description is. So we can look in terms of, like, let's look at example for fluency. So in terms of fluency, we measure that, or we know that by the amount of text that a student might write, and we can look at that at the ease in which they're able to generate text. So the same thing for legibility. That means, can they form letters? Can they do upper and lowercase letters? Do they have correct letter formation? And then we look at conventions, and their students, and I'm sure for you all thinking about your grade level too, you know, conventions may be something that they really have a skill deficit in. And, you know, do they use a punctuation correctly, or do they use, are they able to spell, or is spelling inhibit them from being good writers? Because they get hung up on the spelling, and they get hung up on those words, and then you get short text because they get hung up on those things. Or is it capitalization, or do they not understand grammar rules? So, you know, again, that helps us to think about what do we mean by each one of those areas when we consider that written expression deficit. And then vocabulary. You know, if you've read a piece of the text and it might be something very simple that has very little variation in the vocabulary, and it's very lower level words that they use, and can they even use grade level vocabulary? And a lot of times that's a struggle for our students, isn't it? Because, you know, you might have a 7th or 8th grade student, and their vocabulary is so limited that the word choices that they use with that vocabulary might be around a 1st grade or 2nd grade, or at best, you know, even a 3rd grade level. And then, do they know what words mean? Do they have understanding about those word families? And can they figure out, do they have skills to figure out what those words might be, whether it be context clues, or can they use word families? And you all may have talked about that this morning when you did vocabulary, you know, when you're looking at teaching vocabulary words, how you can teach those as word families and that kind of thing. And then let's look at sentence complexity. So this one is, you know, do they have good short sentences, long sentences? Or is their writing all real short, choppy sentences? For example, the boy ran home, the dog jumped up, you know, those kinds of things. Or can they really have some variance in their structure in their sentences? And are they able to even write complete sentences? And then do they have verb tense agreement? Then let's look at content a little bit. That's your organization, originality, style, cohesion. Can they stay on topic? So that could possibly be a deficit for them, and that might be an area that you would have to work on. And then that final column is that writing process. And as we move those as students, we change that writing process changes, in that 6th grade level, and we start really coming from persuasive writing pieces to more argumentative. There's a big shift when kids go into middle school and what that expectation is around the standards and for them for writing. So that's where a lot of times our kids may have some real deficits, is around being able to just understand that process of writing. That's what I'm talking about with, can they revisit it? Can they edit it? Can they improve on their writing? And so sometimes our kids just need help with the writing process. So that next row there, it says problem indicators. So that'll tell you. So I can look at a piece of writing, and a kid may have a little to no text. Well, then I might say, oh, that's a fluency issue. And I'm not going to read all of those. I'm going to give you 1 minute or two to just kind of read. Do you see how, like, if you're able to figure out what those problem indicators are, how you might can connect that back to a skill deficit that they have? But this third row is probably one of my most favorite pieces of this tool. And this one is about, how do we quantify? How do we know? How do we progress monitor it? Fluency is fairly easy to progress monitor, right? Because we can look at the total words written per minute. But what if we're working on conventions? How do we know how to score that? Because we may have kids that the conventions is their primary problem. And so we develop a goal around conventions and have them working on spelling words correctly, or figuring out if they're writing the words in the correct writing sequence, or we look at the number of errors. Like we look at the number of capitalization, punctuation errors, and we can quantify that. So I think in special education, that's been something we've really tried to think through. How do we quantify? Because we have to show whether or not this student's making progress with the tools and the interventions or the SDI that we've selected. The same thing, look at sentence complexity. You may have a rubric. And so you may have a rubric that you create that doesn't have to be a very complex rubric, but it could have those pieces in there around, do they have sentence variation? You could put it all around there. Is it that they have complete sentences? Do they get a 1, 2, 3 on, or a 4 on, do they have complete sentences? Some way that we can measure, are they making progress? That last bulleted there, it could be under correct word sequence, or it could be that % of complete sentences or the types of sentences. So we could actually measure that. So it's kind of a different way of thinking about how we could analyze what the mistakes that they're making from a writing piece, and then how do we, what do we do to reteach that skill, and then how do we monitor that? And I love that. So you could use a scoring guide if you're working on content, and that makes me think about the old portfolios, we had those scoring guides. And so, kids could even use something like that. So you could have one. And, there are tools that you can create your own scoring rubrics, and it would be relative to the writing pieces that you were working on. But that could be some way that you could have that rubric. And that goes back to when we write that in the IEP goal, and we're saying this is how we're going to measure it, then it has to match what we're measuring, right? So you have to have the measurement tool to match what it is that you wrote in that goal. And so if you're working on a content, and you're working on organization or style or topic, then you can use that rubric. A checklist might be used. Now, and that might be, do you have all the pieces in there, right? Or have I revised, or have I edited, or...
There is a Google extension that I use that would be very helpful with gathering this information. It's called WRI-Q, W-R-I, and then the letter Q.
Uh-huh.
And you have a kid open a Google Doc, and like I usually give my kids a prompt, and they write on their Google Doc that the answer, the response to that prompt, and then they share it with me. Mm-hmm. And when they share it with me and I bring it up on my computer and I open up that extension, it takes that piece of writing and it gives you all the data on it. Like it analyzes it based on like the correct spelling of words. It checks grammar. It does several of these things that's in this sample ways to quantify. And that would be an easy way to, I mean, I've used it to progress monitor my kids, but I like this because this helps me focus in even more with the data that I'm given from that extension.
Because you could assign a prompt, through a Google Classroom, or you could have that set up in a way that you could assign a prompt and then the kids respond and then you could quantify it that way. So you could look that last one, that table down there that says, why is this problem occurring? So this kind of asks some questions that kind of guides our thinking around each one of those areas that might be a problem with in the writing. So if you look at that, if you think about fluency, legibility, conventions, vocabulary, complexity, all of those are part of that deficit or that disability in written expression, really. So it kind of covers the gamut of it, because you're going to have kids that have trouble in all those areas. But this will really help us think about why are they having those troubles, and then how do we know how to teach kids, and how do we support them. It's a tool that we can use to help us think through those, and it kind of guides our thinking, and it kind of shifts the way you've looked at it before, because now you can think of it in a way that you can break it down to those skills that kids might need.